The moment my father told me to stand with the staff at his birthday gala, I did not react. I did not argue. I did not even blink. I stood perfectly still while Robert Miller, the man who was supposed to be proud of me, turned toward his guests, lifted his glass, and laughed. He said the seat beside him was for his guest, so that Sophia could find another place. Laughter rippled across the table. My brother slid smoothly into the empty chair as if it had always belonged to him. My mother lowered her eyes, choosing silence the way she always did. Standing there, surrounded by chandeliers and strangers, I understood something I had avoided my entire life. This was not a joke, not a misunderstanding. It was a decision. They still believed I was nothing. They had no idea who I had become. They had no idea the entire gala depended on my approval. They had no idea the company running that night belonged to me. What would happen later would freeze my father mid-smile and drain the room of sound. But before any of that, you need to understand why I did not react at all. My name is Sophia Miller, and this was the night I stopped trying to earn a seat I was never meant to beg for. The ballroom stretched out before me, vast and meticulously arranged. Chandeliers hung overhead, scattering light across tables dressed in pale linen. Waiters moved between guests with practiced ease, carrying champagne flutes as if nothing unusual had occurred. Everything had been designed to impress, to announce that Robert Miller had reached a certain station in life and intended to remain there. I felt the weight of glances that passed over me without stopping. These were my father's business associates, the people he had cultivated for decades. They knew my brother Julian by name and reputation. They knew my mother as the gracious hostess who remembered preferences and birthdays. But me, I was background noise, the other daughter, the quiet one. The humiliation still burned in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. This was not the first time my father had reminded me of my place in the family. It was simply the first time he had done it so publicly, so casually, as though dismissing me required no more effort than moving a place card. I smoothed my dress and stepped back from the table. Navy silk chosen because I knew it photographed well under event lighting. An old habit from years in this industry, my industry the one my family had never bothered to learn about. Conversation resumed around me. Laughter returned. A woman in emerald earrings smiled at something my brother said. A gray-haired man clapped my father on the shoulder. For them, the moment had already passed. Just another joke. Just another daughter who did not quite measure up. But I noticed what they did not. The catering manager's quick glance away. The hesitation in the event coordinator's step. They knew me, though, not as Sophia Miller, overlooked daughter. They knew me as someone else entirely. I moved toward the edge of the room near the service corridor where staff appeared and disappeared with trays of food. From there, I could see everything, the flow of guests, the timing, the quiet choreography that made the evening appear effortless. My father had hired one of the most prestigious event companies in the city to organize his 70th birthday. He had bragged about it for weeks. The cost, the exclusivity, the guest list. What he did not know, what he had never bothered to ask, was how that company came to exist at all. Caroline, my director of operations, caught my eye from across the room. She was managing a minor technical issue, calm on the surface, alert beneath it. When she saw me standing alone, something flickered across her face. Recognition, concern, a silent question. I gave her a small nod. Everything would proceed as planned. The gala would be flawless because my team had spent months ensuring it would be. Every detail accounted for, every contingency prepared. My father believed he was the architect of this evening, that his money and connections had created the spectacle. The truth was far more complicated. I watched Julian lean back in the seat that should have been mine. He looked comfortable there, as he always did in positions of privilege. He had never questioned his place at the center of things. Why would he? Our parents had spent his entire life assuring him that he belonged there. Memories surfaced without invitation. Birthdays where his gifts were larger, report cards where his average grades were celebrated, while my achievements earned distracted nods. Conversations about college where every resource went to his future, while I was encouraged to be practical, to expect less. I had stopped expecting anything a long time ago. Instead, I built something of my own. My mother finally looked up, her gaze sweeping the room. It passed over me without pause, as if I were part of the decor. Linda Miller had perfection down to an art. What she never mastered was standing between her husband and the daughter he diminished. I no longer blamed her. Blame required energy, and I had stopped spending mine on people who would not change. The evening stretched ahead, speeches, toasts, carefully staged admiration. My father would accept praise, my brother would network, my mother would manage appearances, and I was expected to remain invisible. But something had shifted when my father pointed at that chair and told me I did not belong. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter, final. The last thread of hope that maybe this time would be different snapped cleanly. I looked toward the stage where the program would soon begin. Everything depended on systems and decisions that traced back to a single authority. Tonight was not about where I sat. It was about whether I stayed invisible. And for the first time, the answer was no longer up to them. The laughter from the main table faded as I drifted further into the periphery of the ballroom. Champagne glasses clinked. Conversations rose and fell in the particular rhythm of people performing happiness for an audience. I had heard that sound my entire life, though usually from the margins. Standing near the tall windows that overlooked the city lights, I let my mind wander backward. The gala dissolved around me, replaced by the dining room of my childhood home. Same family, same dynamics, different decade. Growing up in the Miller household meant understanding early that attention was a finite resource, and Julian had first claim to all of it. This wasn't cruelty in any dramatic sense. No one raised their voice, no one slammed doors. The favoritism operated like gravity, invisible but constant, shaping everything in ways you only recognized later. I remembered sitting at our kitchen table, 12 years old, holding a letter from my school. I had been selected for an advanced academic program, one of only 15 students in the district. My heart hammered as I waited for my parents to finish discussing Julian's soccer tryouts. When I finally slid the letter across the table, my father glanced at it briefly. "That's nice, Sophia," he said, then turned back to Julian. "Now, about that coach, I think we should talk to him directly about your position." My mother offered me a small smile. "We're proud of you, sweetie. Very proud." But the conversation never returned to my achievement. It was the last time I willingly offered them proof of my competence. By dinner's end, I had learned to keep my successes private, where they wouldn't compete for attention. The lesson was fast and permanent. I was alone in my victories. The pattern repeated through high school. Julian struggled with academics but excelled at being visible. He joined clubs, ran for student council, dated girls from prominent families. My parents invested in tutors, test prep, whatever he needed to clear each hurdle. Meanwhile, I maintained a near-perfect GPA and took on part-time work to save for college understanding without being told that the family's resources had already been allocated. I don't share this for sympathy. I share it because understanding the past is the only way the present makes sense. My mother played a particular role in maintaining equilibrium. Linda Miller believed in peace above all else, which meant she believed in avoiding any conversation that might disrupt it. When I tried to voice frustration about the imbalance in our family, she would touch my arm gently and say, "You know how your father is. Don't make things difficult." Don't make things difficult. The unofficial Miller family motto, at least for the women. So I learned to not make things difficult. I learned to celebrate Julian's mediocre achievements with appropriate enthusiasm. I learned to shrink my own successes into brief mentions that wouldn't overshadow his. I learned that being the easy child meant being the forgotten one. The strange thing about being overlooked is that it gives you time. While Julian performed for approval, I observed, I studied, I figured out how things actually worked beneath the surface performance of family unity. By the time I left for college, I had already begun building a life separate from the Millers, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. They had made it clear through 1,000 small choices that my future was my own responsibility. So I took that responsibility seriously. I worked through school, double shifts at catering companies' event venues, anywhere that would hire a student willing to show up early and stay late. The work was unglamorous. Setting up folding chairs at 6 in the morning, clearing plates from tables while wealthy guests ignored my existence, troubleshooting emergencies when caterers didn't show or equipment failed. But I paid attention. Every challenge taught me something concrete. I learned how much logistics mattered, how a single missed detail could cascade into disaster. I learned how to read a room, anticipate problems before they erupted, manage personalities without losing focus on outcomes. These weren't skills anyone in my family valued. They didn't know I was acquiring them. Julian graduated and immediately stepped into a junior position at a firm connected to our father's network. His path had been cleared long before he walked it. I graduated with honors and a job offer from a small event planning company that specialized in corporate functions. My starting salary was modest. The money required careful management. During family dinners, when they occurred, conversations centered on Julian's career trajectory, his potential, the doors opening before him. If anyone remembered to ask what I was doing, a vague answer about event work satisfied their minimal curiosity. I preferred it that way. Every time I shared something real, something I was genuinely proud of, the response left me feeling smaller than before. So I stopped sharing. I kept my victories private, safe from the dismissal that had become my family's reflexive response to anything I achieved. Years passed. I climbed through the ranks of my industry. The small company grew under my leadership. Eventually, I saw an opportunity to build something of my own, and I took it. The details of that journey belong to another chapter, but the foundation was laid in those early years of being underestimated. What mattered was this. While my family constructed an image of me as the daughter who never quite figured things out, I was constructing something else entirely. A reputation, a network, a company that eventually became one of the most sought-after event planning firms in the region. I kept my professional life separate from my family name. Partly for privacy, partly because I couldn't bear the thought of my father taking credit or my brother feeling threatened, but mostly because I had learned that my worth didn't require their validation. I had spent too many years seeking approval that never came. Building something without them felt like finally breathing after a lifetime of holding my breath. The irony was that my invisibility made it possible. If they had paid attention, they would have seen the signs. The industry publications that mentioned my name, the awards our company received, the clients who moved in the same social circles as my parents. But they didn't look, so they didn't see. Now, standing in the ballroom of my father's 70th birthday gala, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. The distance between who they thought I was and who I had become wasn't a wound anymore. It was a weapon. Not a weapon I intended to use for cruelty. I had no desire to humiliate my family for sport, but the gap between their assumptions and reality had grown so vast that it could no longer be sustained. Eventually, one version would have to give way to the other. The question was whether I would choose the moment or let it choose me. The first apartment I lived in after college had a radiator that clanged through the night and a window that didn't quite close. I shared it with 2 other women, both of us working jobs that barely covered our rent. We rotated grocery shopping to stretch budgets. We learned which takeout places gave the biggest portions for the least money. Luxury meant sleeping past 7 on a Sunday. I tell you this because my family assumed I struggled. They weren't entirely wrong, but they misunderstood the nature of that struggle. Money was tight, yes, but I was learning. I treated every logistical failure as a lesson. My first job in event planning paid modestly, but it offered something more valuable than a salary. It offered access. I watched senior planners negotiate with vendors, manage demanding clients, solve problems under pressure that would have strained less determined people. I took notes, not on paper, but in my mind. Every observation became a tool I would use later. Within 2 years, I had been promoted twice, not because of connections or charm, but because I was the person who noticed when things were about to go wrong. I caught the catering order that had been entered incorrectly 3 days before a major corporate event. I identified the venue's electrical issue that would have caused a blackout during a presentation. I was the one who stayed late, arrived early, and never complained about either. My boss at the time, a woman named Patricia, who had built her career in an era when women in business faced even more obstacles, pulled me aside one afternoon. "You have something," she said. Don't waste it working for other people forever. I didn't fully understand what she meant until years later, but her words stayed with me. The industry is small enough that reputation matters, and large enough that anonymity is possible if you cultivate it. I cultivated it deliberately. When I eventually left to start my own company, I made choices that kept my personal life separate from my professional identity. I used my full legal name on business documents, but avoided the kind of publicity that would connect me to the Miller family. This wasn't a calculated deception. It was self-preservation. I had watched my brother leverage our father's connections his entire career. Every opportunity Julian received came with invisible strings attached to our family name. I wanted to know beyond any doubt that what I built was mine, that it stood on its own foundation, not borrowed from anyone else's. The early years of my company were demanding. I won't romanticize them. There were months when I wasn't sure I could make payroll, clients who disappeared without paying invoices, competitors who spread rumors about our reliability. I learned to negotiate harder, plan more carefully, and never promise what I couldn't deliver. Slowly things shifted. One successful event led to a referral. That referral led to a larger contract. The larger contract established credibility that attracted more clients. Word spread through networks. I had spent years cultivating quiet networks of professionals who valued competence over pedigree. By the time I turned 27, my company had grown beyond anything I had imagined in that first cold apartment. We handled events for corporations, nonprofits, private clients with specific demands and generous budgets. Our reputation was built on a simple principle: we delivered what we promised, and we solved problems others couldn't. I hired carefully. People who paid attention. People who cared about getting things right. Caroline, my director of operations, had been with me almost from the beginning. She knew the business as well as I did, and had earned her position through years of demonstrated excellence. The team we built shared a commitment to work that mattered, even when the work itself was exhausting. None of this made its way to my family, not because I hid it exactly, but because they never asked the right questions. When I mentioned that work was busy, my father assumed I was complaining about the kind of low-level tasks he imagined I performed. When I said I had a business trip, my mother pictured me assisting someone more important. Their assumptions filled in the blanks I left empty, and I stopped trying to correct them. The truth was, I had given up on being seen by them long before my company became successful. What changed was not my desire for their approval, but my need for it. I had built something that proved my worth to myself. Their opinion had become irrelevant. This is harder to explain than it sounds. The child in me still remembered wanting my father to look at me the way he looked at Julian. Still remembered hoping my mother would defend me just once against the casual dismissals that accumulated like dust. But the adult I had become understood that some people are incapable of seeing you clearly, no matter what you achieve. They have decided who you are, and evidence to the contrary simply doesn't register. My family had decided I was the daughter who would never amount to much. A pleasant enough person, certainly. Harmless, unremarkable. The kind of woman who attends family gatherings and fades into the background while more important people talk about more important things. They had no idea that the event company they hired for my father's 70th birthday, the company whose reputation had impressed my father's business associates, whose fees reflected its status in the industry, belonged to me. I hadn't planned for this specific irony. When the inquiry came through our client services team, I didn't recognize the name of the contact person. It was only after the initial meetings handled by Caroline, because I was traveling, that I realized the event in question was my father's birthday gala. By then, contracts had been signed and deposits paid. I could have withdrawn, could have claimed a conflict of interest and referred them to another firm. But something stopped me. Perhaps curiosity about how they would behave when they thought no one who mattered was watching. Perhaps a desire to prove, at least to myself, that I could execute flawlessly regardless of the personal circumstances. Or perhaps buried beneath all my careful rationality, a part of me wanted to see whether my family would finally notice who I had become. Standing in the ballroom that night, watching my father hold court at the main table, I realized the answer was already clear. They hadn't noticed. They wouldn't notice. not unless something forced them to look. The question of whether to force that reckoning still hung in the air unanswered. There was Thanksgiving 4 years ago, when I almost told them everything. The family had gathered at my parents' house, the same house where Julian and I grew up. The dining room table was set with my mother's good china, the one she brought out for occasions meant to impress. I had just closed the biggest contract of my company's history, a multi-day corporate retreat for a Fortune 500 company, the kind of event that established firms in an entirely different category. I was exhausted and proud, and for a brief moment foolish enough to think my family might want to celebrate with me. We were between courses when my father started talking about Julian's recent promotion. It was a mid-level position at a consulting firm, the kind of advancement that happens automatically after a certain number of years. But to hear my father describe it, you would think Julian had been appointed CEO. When the praise finally wound down, I mentioned that I had some good news too. My mother smiled politely. My father raised his eyebrows in mild interest, the way you might when a child shows you a drawing. I started to explain about the contract, the scope of the project, what it meant for the company's future. I hadn't even finished my second sentence when Julian interrupted with a question about his work, and the conversation pivoted away from me entirely. No one circled back. No one asked me to continue. My news hung in the air for a moment, then evaporated like it had never been spoken. That night, driving back to my apartment, I made a decision. I would stop trying to share my life with people who couldn't be bothered to listen. It wasn't anger exactly, more like the quiet recognition that some doors are locked from the other side, and no amount of knocking will open them. The years that followed reinforced this choice. Every family gathering operated by the same rules. Julian and my father discussed business and politics. My mother managed the social choreography. I sat at the table present but peripheral, contributing just enough to avoid attention while protecting myself from the dismissal I knew would come if I reached for more. I became skilled at deflection. When relatives asked what I was doing, I offered vague answers that invited no follow-up questions. When my mother suggested I should find a stable job or my father implied I should be more ambitious like my brother, I let the comments pass without response. This wasn't cowardice. It was a strategy. I had learned that defending myself only made things worse. Any attempt to assert my accomplishments was met with skepticism, or worse, with comparisons to Julian that left me feeling diminished rather than recognized. The safest course was to let them believe what they wanted, but safety came with a cost. Every unchallenged assumption added another layer to the fiction they had constructed about me. The daughter who couldn't quite get her act together. The one they didn't need to worry about because she wasn't going anywhere. The one who could be dismissed without consequence. I let them build this version of me because confrontation seemed pointless. What would I gain by proving them wrong? A moment of satisfaction followed by weeks of awkward tension. Questions about why I had hidden my success. Accusations that I thought I was better than them. The truth is, I didn't think I was better. I thought I was different. My values, my priorities, my definition of success, none of it aligned with what my family respected. We were speaking different languages, and translation seemed impossible. So I lived a double life. At work, I was respected. My opinions carried weight. People came to me for advice, trusted my judgment, followed my lead. At home, there was background noise. The overlooked daughter who still showed up to family events out of obligation more than desire. The disconnect should have been painful, but I had grown numb to it. You can get used to almost anything if it happens gradually enough. The gap between my professional identity and my family role widened so slowly that I barely noticed until it became uncrossable. What I didn't anticipate was how the numbness would wear off. Years of small indignities accumulated into something larger, something I couldn't ignore. Every time my father praised Julian for ordinary achievements while ignoring my exceptional ones. Every time my mother gently steered the subject away when I tried to speak. Every time I sat at a table where I was technically welcome but fundamentally unwanted. The night of the gala, being told to stand with the staff, was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of decades of being made small. My father didn't suddenly become cruel that evening. He had always treated me this way. The only difference was the audience. Standing in the ballroom watching my family perform their roles with such confidence, I understood something that had eluded me before. My silence had not protected anyone. It had only enabled the disrespect to continue. Every time I failed to correct them, I gave permission. Permission to assume the worst about me. Permission to treat me as less valuable than my brother. Permission to dismiss me in front of strangers without fear of consequence. I had told myself I was keeping the peace. But peace built on my erasure wasn't peace at all. It was surrender. The question I faced now was whether to continue surrendering or to finally draw a line. Not out of revenge, though the temptation existed, but out of self-respect. Out of recognition that I deserved to be seen for who I actually was, not who they had decided I must be. The timing wasn't ideal. A family birthday party surrounded by guests who had witnessed my humiliation. But maybe there was no ideal time. Maybe I had been waiting for permission that would never come. On the stage, the technical crew was setting up for the evening's program. Microphones being tested, screens being calibrated, the machinery of celebration preparing to perform. I knew exactly how that machinery worked. I had built it. The only question left was what I would do with that knowledge. The venue was a renovated mansion on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place that appeared in magazines and hosted fundraisers for causes with expensive entry fees. My father had chosen it specifically because of what it signaled about his status. Not old money, but successful enough to belong in spaces designed for old money. I had arrived early before my family, before most of the guests. This was standard practice for any event my company managed. Final walkthroughs. Verification that every detail met our standards, the 100 small adjustments that transformed a beautiful space into a flawless one. My team moved through the venue with practiced efficiency. Centerpieces positioned precisely, lighting checked and rechecked. Place cards arranged according to the seating chart we had spent 2 weeks negotiating with the client's assistant. Every element aligned with the vision we had been paid to execute. By the time the first guests began arriving, I had stepped back into observer mode. Dressed appropriately for the occasion, but deliberately unremarkable. One of many well-dressed women in a crowd of well-dressed people. My presence registered only with the staff who knew to look for me. Then my family arrived, and the atmosphere shifted. My father entered the way he entered every room, as though he expected applause. He moved through the crowd, accepting handshakes and compliments with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment privately. The venue impressed his colleagues. The guest list reflected his reach. Everything about the evening announced that Robert Miller mattered. My mother followed a step behind, performing her own role with equal polish. She complimented dresses, remembered names, made contact with just the right combination of warmth and formality. Linda Miller had spent 40 years perfecting the art of social navigation. Tonight was her showcase as much as my father's. Julian arrived with his wife, a woman whose family connections had been a major factor in their marriage. They made a handsome pair, both of them wearing the particular expression of people who expected to be photographed, which of course they would be. The event photographer had specific instructions about which guests should be captured prominently. I watched them from a distance that felt natural, near enough to observe, but far enough to remain invisible, a familiar position. The conversations that floated past me were predictable. Business deals, market trends, golf handicaps, the social currency of men who measured their worth in transactions and connections. My father moved among them fluently, collecting validation with every exchange. At one point, Julian noticed me standing near the bar. He nodded in my direction, a brief acknowledgement that cost him nothing, then turned back to whatever more important person had captured his attention. I returned the nod with equal brevity. We had long since stopped pretending we had anything to say to each other. A woman I didn't recognize approached me with the slightly aggressive friendliness of someone who expected everyone to know who she was. "And you are?" she asked, looking me over with an undisguised assessment. "Sophia," I said. "I'm Robert's daughter." Her expression flickered. Surprise, perhaps, that there was another Miller offspring she hadn't catalogued. "Oh, how lovely. Are you involved with the company?" She meant my father's business interests. I understood the assumption. "No," I said. "I work in event planning." "How nice." The way she said it made clear that she found nothing nice about it. She was already scanning the room for someone more worthy of her attention. "Well, enjoy the party." I did not correct her assumption that I was a minor player in someone else's industry. I did not mention that the event she was about to enjoy had been designed and executed under my direction. The exchange was so familiar, it barely registered as painful anymore. Around me, the gala continued its precisely calibrated performance. Servers circulated with trays of canapés designed by a caterer my team had vetted extensively. A string quartet played selections we had chosen to complement the ambiance without overwhelming conversation. Everything worked because we had ensured it would. My father remained the center of gravity throughout the cocktail hour. People sought him out, offered congratulations, laughed at jokes I could not hear. He accepted their attention as his due, never once questioning whether he had earned it or whether someone else had arranged for him to receive it. When the time came for guests to find their seats, the true hierarchy of the evening became visible. The main table, positioned prominently near the stage, was reserved for my father, my mother Julian, and his wife, and select guests whose importance warranted proximity to the host. I had not been included in the seating chart discussions. The assistant who handled communications with my team had never mentioned whether Robert Miller's daughter would require specific accommodation. We had assumed she was a guest like any other, assigned to a table appropriate for extended family members of lesser significance. Only when I approached the main table, operating on the assumption that daughters sat with fathers at birthday celebrations, did the reality become clear. My father looked up from his conversation as I reached for the empty chair beside him. For a moment, his expression was blank, as though he was trying to place me. Then recognition arrived, followed immediately by irritation. What he said next would echo through everything that followed. But in that moment, standing before my family and their carefully assembled witnesses, I still believed the evening might proceed without confrontation. I was wrong. The chair was upholstered in ivory fabric, positioned at the head table with a clear view of the stage. It sat empty beside my father, the only unoccupied space in a room that had been meticulously arranged. I reached for it the way anyone reaches for an expected seat, without thought, without hesitation. Just the simple assumption that a daughter belongs near her father at his birthday celebration. My father's voice stopped me before I could touch the chair. "That seat is for my guest," he said. Not quietly, loud enough for the tables around us to hear. "Sophia can find another spot, or stand with the staff." The words landed sharply. I felt a sudden painful pressure in my chest that made breathing momentarily difficult. Around us, conversations paused. Faces turned toward the small drama unfolding at the main table. My father smiled as he spoke, as though he had said something clever. A few guests chuckled nervously, uncertain whether they were witnessing a joke or something more uncomfortable. The woman in emerald earrings, the one who had approached me earlier, laughed outright. Julian rose from his seat 2 chairs down. Without a word, he moved to the empty chair beside our father and sat down. His expression carried no apology, no hesitation. He accepted the position as naturally as he accepted every position that had been cleared for him. My mother kept her eyes fixed on her plate. She did not look at me, did not protest, did not offer the minimal defense of suggesting that surely there was room for both children at the family table. Her silence was its own statement, one I had heard countless times before. I stood frozen. The seconds stretched into something longer, filled with the ambient sounds of a party that had paused to witness my humiliation. Silverware against porcelain, ice shifting in glasses, the distant murmur of the string quartet, which had not stopped playing because no one had signaled them to stop. What do you do in a moment like that? I had faced difficult situations before. Crises that required immediate decisions, problems that seemed insurmountable until I found solutions. But this was different. This was my family in front of witnesses declaring with absolute clarity that I did not belong. The child inside me wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, to ask what I had done to deserve being ranked below a stranger at my own father's birthday party. The professional inside me understood that scenes accomplished nothing, that whatever point I made would be overshadowed by the spectacle of making it. So I did neither. I straightened my spine, smoothed the fabric of my dress, let my expression settle into something neutral, unreadable. "Carry on," I said. 2 words, quiet enough that only the nearest tables could hear. My father's smile flickered uncertain. He had expected tears, perhaps, or a hasty retreat, some confirmation that his dismissal had achieved its intended effect. Instead, I stepped back from the main table and walked toward the edge of the room, not hurrying, not fleeing, simply removing myself from a space where I had been told I was unwanted. Behind me, the party resumed. Conversations restarted. The moment was already being absorbed into the evening's general flow, reframed as a minor awkwardness rather than the cruelty it actually was. But something had changed inside me. The last thread connecting me to the fiction of family unity had broken. Years of accommodation. Years of making myself smaller to avoid conflict. Years of hoping that if I just tried harder, loved better, achieved more, they might finally see me as I deserved to be seen. All of it ended at that table with that chair with the words my father chose to say in front of everyone who mattered to him. I found a position near the service corridor where the event staff moved in and out with practiced invisibility. Caroline spotted me from across the room. Her expression shifted through confusion, concern, and something that looked like anger on my behalf. I shook my head slightly. Not now. Whatever conversation we needed to have could wait until the guests had gone and the venue was empty. The evening's program would begin soon, speeches prepared by my father's associates, a slideshow chronicling his achievements. The performance of appreciation for a man who had spent his life ensuring certain people understood their value, while others understood their lack of it. I watched the main table from my peripheral vision. My father leaned toward Julian, sharing some private comment that made them both laugh. My mother had composed herself, her social smile firmly restored. They looked like a family, a successful, happy, united family. The illusion was perfect, and it was entirely false. I thought about the contracts in my office, the ones that bore my signature, my company's name, the agreements that gave me authority over every aspect of this event. At any moment I could exercise that authority, could stop the evening in its tracks, could reveal what my family had never bothered to learn. But revenge served cold is still revenge. Whatever I chose to do, it would be deliberate, calculated, worthy of the person I had become, not a reaction to the person they still believed I was. The lights dimmed slightly, signaling that the program was about to begin. Guests shifted in their seats, turning toward the stage. My father sat at the center of his celebration, surrounded by the people he valued occupying the position he believed he had earned. He had no idea what was coming. Neither at that moment did I. I only knew that the quiet daughter they had dismissed had finally reached the end of her tolerance, and that endings sometimes are really beginnings. I stepped into the service corridor, away from the chandeliers and the forced laughter and the family that had just publicly declared me worthless. The hallway was functional, designed for staff rather than guests. Plain walls, concrete floors, the infrastructure that kept beautiful events running while remaining invisible to those being served. Here, I could breathe. Caroline found me within minutes. She was too professional to abandon her responsibilities, but too loyal to pretend nothing had happened. "I saw," she said simply. "Are you okay?" I considered the question. Was I okay? The humiliation still burned a physical sensation in my chest that made each breath feel like effort. But beneath the pain, something else was emerging. Clarity. The particular clarity that comes when you finally stop hoping for something that will never happen. "I will be," I said. She waited, giving me space to say more or to say nothing. This was why I had hired her years ago. Caroline understood that some moments required presence more than solutions. "They have no idea," I said finally, "who I am, what I do, any of it." She nodded. This was not news to her. "What do you want to do?" The question contained multitudes. What did I want at this moment? In the next hour? In the larger arc of my relationship with a family that had spent my entire life treating me as an afterthought, I didn't have an answer yet, only the certainty that something had to change. We walked through the service corridor together, past catering stations and equipment rooms, toward the back offices where the operational heart of the event hummed quietly. My team was monitoring everything from here: security feeds, vendor communications, the timeline that kept each element of the evening synchronized. This was my world, the one I had built while my family looked the other way. Every successful event we produced had reinforced my reputation in an industry where reputation was currency. Every satisfied client had expanded our network. Every problem we solved had proven we were worth the premium we charged. My father had hired my company because we were the best, because our name carried weight with the people he wanted to impress. He had no idea the name was mine. I pulled up the evening schedule on one of the monitors. The program was structured around my father's preferences speeches from colleagues he respected, a video tribute compiled from photos and testimonials, recognition of his business achievements. Everything designed to celebrate Robert Miller as the central figure of his own story. The irony was not lost on me. A man who had never recognized his daughter's accomplishments would spend the evening being recognized for his own. My phone buzzed with a message from one of our security staff. A minor issue with a guest who had overindulged, nothing that required my direct attention. I delegated with a few quick texts, watching the situation resolve through the protocols we had established. This was what competence looked like. Not the performance my father specialized in, but the actual work of making things function. I had spent years developing systems that worked even when I wasn't watching. Staff who knew their roles and executed them without constant supervision. Standards that ensured consistency across events of vastly different scales. None of this mattered to my family. They saw what they wanted to see: a daughter who had failed to match her brother's trajectory, who worked in some vague service industry role, who deserved to be seated with the staff rather than the guests. The unfairness of it pressed against my chest. Not just tonight's public humiliation, but all the years of being defined by their assumptions rather than my reality. I thought about the thousands of hours I had invested in building this company, the nights I worked until exhaustion, the relationships I cultivated through consistent excellence, the risks I took when safer options were available, all of it invisible to the people who should have known me best. They never asked. That was the part that hurt most. Not their ignorance, but their indifference. Questions like, "What are you working on?" or "How is business?" or "Tell me about your clients" had simply never occurred to them. My life existed outside their frame of reference, so it didn't exist at all. Back in the ballroom, the first speaker was taking the stage. A colleague of my father's from his early career days, someone who would tell stories about deals closed and challenges overcome. The audience would laugh at appropriate moments, applaud at the designated pauses, and feel they were participating in something meaningful. I watched through the service door, observing without being observed. My father sat at the main table with Julian beside him, both of them wearing expressions of comfortable satisfaction. They were exactly where they believed they belonged. A few rows back, I spotted the woman who had questioned me earlier. She was nodding along with the speaker's remarks, performing engagement for anyone who might be watching. High society was full of such performances. People pretending to listen while calculating their next move. I had never been good at those calculations. My approach was simpler: do excellent work and let the results speak for themselves. This strategy had served me well in business, where outcomes mattered more than appearances. But the family operated by different rules. Outcomes were less important than narratives, and the narrative my family had constructed about me had no room for the person I actually was. The speech ended with applause. Another speaker took the stage. The evening's program would continue for at least another hour, building toward the climax of my father's own remarks. I had that hour to decide what, if anything, I would do. Not revenge, exactly. The word felt wrong, too small for what I was contemplating. More like a correction, a rebalancing of the scales that had been tilted against me for so long. Whatever happened next, I wanted it to be deliberate. Not a reaction to pain, but a choice made from clarity. The power to change this evening was in my hands. Whether I used it was still undetermined. But standing in that service corridor, watching my family celebrate while I remained invisible, I knew I was done being the daughter they could dismiss. One way or another, they were about to learn who I really was. The transition between speakers created a natural pause in the evening. Guests shifted in their seats, checked their phones, and whispered to their neighbors. The stage crew adjusted microphones and lighting for the next segment. I had spent years observing these moments, the brief intervals when attention scattered before reconvening. They were opportunities if you knew how to use them. A skilled event manager could redirect the entire energy of a room during a transition like this. My phone buzzed. A text from Caroline Video Tribute ready to go. Waiting on your signal for timing. The video tribute was the emotional centerpiece of the evening. Photographs from my father's life arranged chronologically with music and testimonials from colleagues and friends. My team had produced it from materials provided by my mother's assistant, without any input from me beyond quality review. I typed back, "Hold for my mark." The evening's original timeline called for the video to play immediately following the current speaker, but timelines could be adjusted. That was why we built flexibility into every event we managed. I moved from the service corridor toward the edge of the ballroom, not to the main floor where guests mingled and my family held court, but to the technical booth where our audiovisual team monitored every feed. Marcus, our lead technician, looked up when I entered. He was too professional to show surprise, but I caught the slight widening of his eyes. Owners didn't usually visit the booth mid-event unless something had gone wrong. "Everything's running smoothly," he said, anticipating my question. "Good." I studied the array of monitors showing different camera angles of the ballroom. The main table was visible on 2 of them. My father listened to the speaker and performed attentively, Julian checking his phone beneath the table. My mother maintains her perfect posture. "I need to make a schedule adjustment," I said. "After the current speaker before the video tribute, I want to add a segment." Marcus nodded, making notes. He didn't ask questions. Changes happened at events all the time, and our team was trained to accommodate them seamlessly. "I'll need a microphone on stage," I continued. "And can you have the house lights at half during my remarks full bright after—" Now his expression shifted. "Your remarks." Brief introduction before the tribute. The client's daughter wants to say a few words about her father. The lie was close enough to the truth that it required no elaboration. Marcus accepted it with professional efficiency and began coordinating with the stage crew. I left the booth and made my way toward the stage entrance, moving through spaces designed for staff rather than guests. Each step felt deliberate, weighted with the decision I was making. What was I going to say? I still didn't know exactly. The speech hadn't been written, hadn't been rehearsed. Everything that followed would emerge from whatever truth I could find in the moment. The current speaker wrapped up his remarks with a toast to my father. Applause rippled through the room. On cue, the MC stepped forward to announce the next segment. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried through the excellent sound system my team had installed. "Before we continue with our tribute to Robert Miller, we have a brief introduction from someone very special." I watched the confusion play across my father's face from my position near the stage. He hadn't been informed of any addition to the program. My mother looked equally puzzled, scanning the room to see who was approaching the stage. The MC continued, "Please welcome Sophia Miller." The silence that followed my name was its own kind of music, not the appreciative pause that precedes applause, but the uncertain quiet of a crowd trying to process unexpected information. I walked onto the stage with the measured pace I had learned from watching hundreds of speakers, not rushing, not hesitating, claiming the space as though I belonged there, because I did belong there, more than anyone else in the room knew. The microphone felt familiar in my hand. I had tested countless microphones in countless venues, ensuring the audio would carry clearly to every seat. This one was properly calibrated. My voice would reach the farthest corners of the ballroom without distortion. "Thank you," I said, and my voice was steady. "I'll keep this brief, as I know we're all eager to see the tribute." My eyes found my father's. He was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite name. Confusion, certainly, perhaps the beginnings of irritation that his carefully orchestrated evening had been disrupted. Many of you know me as Robert Miller's daughter, the quiet one, the one who works in— I paused, letting the silence build event planning. A few knowing chuckles from the audience. They thought they understood the joke. The overlooked daughter makes a gentle bid for attention at her father's celebration. What you might not know, I continued, is that the company responsible for this evening's event is one I founded, one I own, one I've built over the past decade while my family— another pause— was otherwise occupied. The laughter stopped. In its place, a different kind of silence. The silence of people recalculating everything they thought they knew. I named my company, watched recognition dawn on faces throughout the room. Several guests exchanged glances, connecting dots that had previously been invisible. I mention this not for recognition, but for context. My voice remained even. My team has worked for months to ensure my father's birthday would be memorable, coordinating vendors, the venue, and countless details. I turned slightly, directing my next words toward the main table. I hope it will be. The applause that followed was tentative, uncertain. People weren't sure whether they were witnessing a heartfelt tribute or something more complicated. Some clapped enthusiastically. Others watched my father's reaction before committing. My father's face had gone pale. Julian had stopped checking his phone. My mother's perfect composure had cracked, revealing something that looked like fear. I handed the microphone back to the MC and walked off stage without waiting for further response. Behind me, the video tribute began playing, filling the room with images of my father's life while he sat motionless at his table, processing what had just happened. The evening would continue. The program would proceed, but everything had changed, and everyone in that room knew it. The video tribute played for 7 minutes, 7 minutes of carefully curated photographs and testimonials celebrating Robert Miller's achievements. 7 minutes, during which my father sat rigid in his chair, no longer the relaxed center of attention he had been moments before. I watched from the back of the room, not hiding, but not claiming space either, simply observing as the reality I had introduced began to settle into the minds of everyone present. The first direct approach came from Jeffrey Hartwell, a venture capitalist whose firm had used my company for 3 major events in the past 2 years. He found me near the bar where I had positioned myself with deliberate visibility. "Sophia Miller," he said, extending his hand. "I had no idea. Your team did our annual fundraiser last spring. Impeccable work." "Thank you, Jeffrey. I appreciate the business." He glanced toward the main table where my family sat in uncomfortable silence. "Quite a revelation. Your father must be very proud." The irony was too sharp to touch. "We'll see," I said, and let him draw his own conclusions. Word spread through the ballroom in the particular way information travels among people who trade in connections. I could track its progress by watching clusters of guests lean toward each other, speak in lowered voices, then look in my direction with newly appraising eyes. The dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the overlooked daughter who could be dismissed with a laugh. I was someone whose company had been hired, whose authority had been exercised, whose position demanded recalculation. My brother approached next. Julian moved through the crowd with less confidence than usual, his path toward me interrupted by guests who wanted to offer comments or questions he couldn't answer. When he finally reached me, his expression was complicated. Anger, confusion, something that might have been embarrassment. "What the hell was that?" His voice was pitched low, private. That was the truth. "You could have said something before. Give us some warning." "Would it have changed anything?" He didn't have an answer for that. We both knew it wouldn't have. My family's treatment of me wasn't based on ignorance, it was based on indifference. Knowing about my company wouldn't have changed how my father saw me, only how he performed seeing me in public. "People are talking," Julian said. "Good." His jaw tightened. This was not the dynamic he was accustomed to. In every previous family interaction, I had been the one who accommodated, who smoothed over tensions, who made things easier for everyone else. Not anymore. "Dad wants to talk to you," he said finally. I'll be here." But I didn't move toward the main table. If my father wanted to address what had happened, he could come to me. I was done crossing rooms to be dismissed. The video tribute ended. Applause more subdued than the planners had intended. The MC attempted to return to the scheduled program, announcing my father's own remarks as the evening's finale. My father rose from his seat, but the confident posture he had worn earlier was gone. He walked to the stage like a man approaching an uncertain outcome rather than a celebration in his honor. His speech had been written weeks ago. I had reviewed it as part of our standard client preparation, reflections on his career, gratitude for his family and colleagues, the usual sentiments delivered with the practiced charm he had cultivated over decades. But the speech he gave was not the one he had prepared. The words came out stilted, disconnected. He kept glancing toward where I stood, as though trying to reconcile the daughter he had dismissed with the business owner whose work surrounded him. "Family," he said at one point, "has always been important to me. Both my children have contributed in their own ways to who I am today." It was the first time in my memory that he had acknowledged me as a contributor to anything. The statement was vague, offered no specifics, and did nothing to address the years of favoritism or the public humiliation he had delivered earlier that evening. But the fact that he felt compelled to say it at all was its own kind of victory. After the speech, the evening entered its final phase. Dessert served, coffee poured. Guests began to calculate their exits while maintaining the appearance of lingering appreciation. I circulated through the room accepting acknowledgement from people who now understood they had underestimated me. Each conversation added to the reshaping of my professional and social position. By tomorrow, the story of this evening would be repeated across networks I had spent years building. Robert Miller's overlooked daughter revealed as the owner of the firm producing his birthday gala. The narrative practically wrote itself. My mother found me as the crowd thinned. She had waited until fewer people were watching, maintaining her instinct for discretion, even in a moment that demanded directness. "Sophia," her voice was strained, "we should talk, as a family. Should we?" The question wasn't sarcastic. It was genuine. After everything that had happened, I wasn't sure what a family conversation could accomplish. "Your father is processing," she said. Tonight was unexpected. For him, maybe. For me, it was clarifying. She winced at the word. Clarity had never been Linda Miller's priority. She preferred the comfortable ambiguity that allowed conflicts to remain unaddressed. "Come to the house tomorrow," she said. "Please. We need to understand." I considered the request. Part of me wanted to refuse to let them sit with their discomfort the way I had sat with mine for 30 years. But another part recognized that closure required confrontation. Whatever happened next in my relationship with my family, it wouldn't happen through avoidance. "I'll come," I said, "but I won't pretend that tonight didn't happen, and I won't apologize for it." She nodded, accepting the terms, because she had no leverage to negotiate different ones. The gala wound down around us. Guests departed with air kisses and promises to connect soon. My team began the methodical work of breakdown and cleanup that transformed celebration spaces back to their original states. I stayed until the end. Not because I had to. Caroline was more than capable of managing the closing procedures, but because I wanted to witness every stage of the evening I had made possible. My father left without speaking to me again. Julian and his wife followed shortly after. My mother was the last of my family to depart, pausing at the door to look back at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then they were gone, and I remained. The woman who had been told to stand with the staff, standing at the center of the room she had built. The meeting at my parents' house happened 3 days after the gala. I arrived at precisely the time we had agreed upon, driving up the same driveway where I had learned to ride a bicycle, parking in front of the same door I had entered thousands of times as a child. The house looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had grown in ways that made it seem that way. My mother answered the door. Her face showed the strain of a sleepless weekend lines visible beneath her careful makeup. She led me to the formal living room where my father and Julian already waited. The seating arrangement was revealing. My father occupied his usual chair, the one position to dominate the room. Julian sat on the sofa. An empty space had been left for me, but not beside anyone. apart. I chose a different chair entirely, one that put me at an equal vantage point rather than the subordinate position they had prepared. My father started speaking without a preamble. "You should have told us." "Should I?" "We had a right to know. About the company, about your involvement with the event." I let his words hang in the air, the assumption that they had rights to information about my life, the framing of the situation as my failure to inform rather than their failure to notice. "I built my company over 10 years ago," I said. "In that time you never once asked what I did for work, not with any real interest, not in a way that suggested you wanted to know." "That's not—" Julian started. "3 months ago, your assistant sent an inquiry to my firm. She had no idea she was contacting your daughter, because you had never mentioned my name in connection with anything successful." My father's face reddened. The humiliation of the gala now replayed in private with no audience to perform for. "The night of your birthday," I continued, "you told me to stand with the staff, in front of your colleagues, your friends, people you wanted to impress. You chose that moment to make absolutely clear how little you valued me." I didn't know. That's exactly the point. My voice remained level, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. You didn't know because you never cared to know. Not about my work, not about my accomplishments, not about anything that would have challenged your belief that I was less important than Julian. The room fell silent. Outside, a car passed on the street. Normal life continued while inside this house something irreversible was happening. "Since the gala," I said, "I've had interesting conversations with people in your business networks, people who attended that evening." My father's posture shifted, alert now sensing danger he hadn't anticipated. "3 of your pending deals have been put on hold," I continued. "The investors aren't comfortable with the optics. A man who publicly demeans his daughter doesn't inspire confidence as a partner." "That's your exaggerating. Jeffrey Hartwell called me personally. He expressed concerns about your judgment. He and his partners are reconsidering their involvement in your latest venture." The color drained from my father's face. Jeffrey Hartwell represented significant capital. His reconsideration was not a minor setback. "This isn't revenge," I said, and I meant it. "I haven't made a single call to damage your reputation. I haven't told anyone what to think or how to act. All I did was tell the truth. The consequences are unfolding on their own." Julian leaned forward. "You have to fix this. Call Hartwell. Tell him—" "Tell him what?" "That my father didn't mean it when he humiliated me, that the man who belittled his daughter in front of 100 witnesses is actually a wonderful person." I shook my head. "The truth doesn't need my defense, and neither do the conclusions people draw from it." My mother had been silent throughout, watching the conversation with an expression of muted horror. Now she spoke. "Sophia, please. We're still family." "Are we?" The question was not rhetorical. When has this family included me? When have I been invited to the table without having to fight for a seat? No one answered. The silence confirmed what I already knew. I stood. There was nothing more to accomplish in this room. I put my hands on the arms of the chair and pushed myself up the velvet, offering little resistance. "I'm not here to destroy you," I said, looking at my father. "But I am finished protecting you from the consequences of how you've treated me. If your business suffers because people saw who you really are, that's not my responsibility. I spent 30 years making myself smaller so you could feel bigger. That's over." My father looked older than he had 3 days ago. The confidence that had defined him seemed diminished, uncertain of its foundation. "What do you want?" he asked. The question sounded like it cost him something to speak. "Nothing you can give me." I picked up my purse. I let the statement hang there, a full stop to the decades of striving for his approval. The recognition I needed, I found on my own. The respect I deserved, I built for myself. There's nothing you have that I need anymore. I walked toward the door. My mother rose to follow, then stopped, caught between the husband she had always protected and the daughter she had always neglected. "Sophia," I paused at the threshold. "If you want a relationship with me going forward, it will have to be real. Not performances, not pretending. I won't accept anything less." Then I left, down the driveway, into my car, away from the house where I had learned so early that I wasn't enough. Behind me, everything they had built on the foundation of my diminishment was beginning to crumble, and I felt no need to watch it fall. The weeks following the gala moved quickly. My company secured 2 major contracts from connections made that evening. Clients who had witnessed the revelation and wanted to align themselves with the emerging narrative rather than the established one. The stakes had suddenly increased for me, but the reward was greater confidence. In business, perception matters, and the perception of me had transformed overnight from overlooked daughter to self-made success story. People wanted to be part of that story. They wanted to tell their own networks that they worked with Sophia Miller, the woman who had quietly built an empire while her family looked the other way. The irony was not lost on me. The same dynamics that had disadvantaged me for years, the assumption that women of a certain type were not to be taken seriously, now worked in my favor. An underdog narrative plays well in rooms full of people who want to believe in meritocracy. My father's situation deteriorated in ways I tracked only through industry gossip. The deal with Hartwell's firm collapsed entirely. Other partnerships, sensing weakness, extracted better terms or withdrew altogether. His reputation, built over decades, had acquired a crack that widened with each retelling of the gala story. Julian called twice. I didn't answer. His voicemails were a mixture of attempted reconciliation and barely concealed resentment. He wanted things to return to normal, which meant returning to a dynamic where he held position and I did not. I deleted the messages without response. My mother reached out more carefully. A text asking if I was well. An email with a recipe she thought I might like. Small gestures that cost her nothing, but signaled that she was thinking of me. I appreciated the gestures without trusting them. Linda Miller had spent my entire life choosing comfort over confrontation. A few texts did not constitute the transformation necessary for a real relationship. Work continued, events to plan, clients to satisfy, the ordinary demands of running a successful business. I found comfort in the routine and the concrete problems that could be solved through competence and effort. But something had shifted inside me as well. The constant background noise of seeking approval had finally gone quiet. I no longer measured my days against the standard of what my family might think. I no longer shaped my choices around avoiding their judgment. The freedom was disorienting at first. I had spent so long contorting myself to fit their expectations that I wasn't entirely sure what shape I would take without that pressure. Caroline noticed the change before I could articulate it. "You seem lighter," she said one afternoon as we reviewed logistics for an upcoming event. "Less compressed." The word was apt. For years I had been compressed, squeezed into a smaller version of myself to make room for people who would never return the consideration. Now I am expanding, taking up space, allowing myself to be visible in ways I had always avoided. The professional world responded positively. Colleagues who had known me only as efficient and reliable began to see other dimensions. I spoke more freely in meetings, took more creative risks in event design, allowed my personality to inform my work rather than hiding behind neutrality. These changes rippled outward. My team seemed more engaged, responding to the energy I brought rather than the caution I had previously maintained. Clients commented on the freshness of our proposals. Industry publications took notice of our innovative approaches. None of this would have been possible while I was still managing my family's opinions along with everything else. The cognitive load of constantly monitoring their reactions had consumed resources I could now redirect toward growth. 1 month after the gala, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The sender identified herself as a graduate student writing her thesis on women entrepreneurs who had built businesses without family capital or connections. She had heard my story from a contact in the industry and wanted to interview me. My first instinct was to decline. I had never sought publicity, had deliberately kept my personal life separate from my professional identity. But something had changed. The secrecy that had once felt protective now felt like a remnant of the old dynamic, a concession to a family that no longer had a claim on my choices. I agreed to the interview. Not for recognition, but for documentation. My story was worth telling not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. Countless women had built success despite being underestimated by the people closest to them. Our narratives deserved space in the record. The interview lasted 2 hours. I spoke about the early years, the struggle to establish credibility, the choices I had made to keep my professional and personal lives separate. I spoke about the gala, not with anger, but with clarity about what it revealed. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked near the end. The secrecy, the confrontation. How did everything come out? I considered the question carefully. Regret implied I would choose differently if given another chance. "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "I regret that my family created conditions where the only options were invisibility or exposure. But given those options, no. I made the choice that honored who I had become." The interview would be published months later as part of a larger collection of stories about women navigating family dynamics in business. It would reach readers I would never meet, perhaps inspiring some to claim their own space. But in the immediate weeks after the gala, the impact was more personal. I was learning to live without the weight I had carried for so long. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was taking up exactly as much space as I deserved. 6 months passed, long enough for the acute aftermath to settle into something more permanent, long enough to know that the changes in my family were real, not just reactions to the crisis. My father's business never fully recovered, not because of anything I did directly, but because the gala had revealed character flaws that made potential partners cautious. Robert Miller, it turned out, had been coasting on a reputation that couldn't survive scrutiny. He reached out once, about 4 months in. A formal email suggesting we have lunch to discuss the future. I agreed, curious what he might have to say. We met at a restaurant neither of us had associations with. Neutral territory. He looked older than I remembered, diminished in ways that went beyond the business setbacks. Something fundamental had shifted in how he carried himself. "I've been thinking," he said after we had ordered, "about how things were between us." I waited, not filling the silence. "I didn't know," he continued, "about your company, about what you had built. And I should have asked." The acknowledgement surprised me, not because it absolved anything, but because I hadn't expected it at all. "You should have," I agreed. "I was hard on you, harder than I should have been." He turned his water glass in circles on the table. I saw Julian's path clearly, business school connections, the trajectory I understood. With you, I didn't know what to make of someone who did things differently. "So you decided I wasn't doing anything at all?" He flinched slightly. "Yes, I suppose I did." The food arrived. Neither of us had much appetite. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said. "I know I haven't earned it. I'm just trying to understand how I missed so much." "You missed it because you weren't looking." He nodded. The simple acceptance of responsibility was more than I had received in 30 years. We finished the meal with careful conversation about surface topics. The weather. A new restaurant is opening nearby. Nothing that required vulnerability from either of us. As we stood to leave, my father paused. "I'm proud of what you've built," he said. "I should have said that a long time ago. I should have seen it a long time ago." The words landed somewhere deep in a place I had stopped expecting anything to reach. They didn't heal the wounds of 30 years. They didn't transform our relationship into what it might have been, but they were at least true. "Thank you," I said. "That matters more than you probably know." We didn't embrace. We didn't make plans for a follow-up. But something had completed itself in that conversation. A circle closing finally after decades of remaining open. My relationship with my mother evolved differently. She began calling regularly, asking genuine questions about my work and life. The conversations were awkward at first, marked by long pauses as we both navigated unfamiliar territory. But gradually, something authentic emerged. Linda Miller was never going to be the mother who defended me fiercely or fought my battles. But she was capable, I discovered, of listening, of showing interest, of acknowledging in her indirect way that she had not done enough. Julian and I settled into cordial distance. We exchanged messages on holidays. We attended the same family gatherings without incident. But the closeness that might have existed between siblings who respected each other, that had never developed, and I stopped hoping it would. Some relationships cannot be salvaged. The foundation was never strong enough to build on. A year after the gala, I was invited to speak at a conference for women entrepreneurs. The topic was building businesses without traditional support systems. I prepared carefully, crafting a talk that balanced personal story with practical wisdom. The audience was filled with women at various stages of their own journeys. Some were just starting out, still seeking validation from families who didn't understand their choices. Others were established, having made peace with the distance between their professional success and personal relationships. I told them about the chair at my father's gala, about being told to stand with the staff, about the moment I decided to stop accepting diminishment from people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. But mostly I told them about what came after. The discovery that self-respect doesn't require anyone else's permission. The realization that we can build our own tables when we're not welcome at existing ones. The freedom that comes from finally fully choosing ourselves. The seat I have now, I concluded, is one I chose for myself. Not because anyone invited me to sit. Not because I earned approval from people who had already decided I was worthless. I chose it because I finally understood that my value was never theirs to determine. The applause was generous, but what moved me more were the faces in the audience, women nodding in recognition, women wiping away tears, women who saw their own stories reflected in mine. After the talk, a young woman approached me. She was probably mid-20s, just beginning her career, navigating family expectations that didn't align with her ambitions. "How do you stop caring?" she asked. "What do they think of you?" I thought about her question carefully. It deserved a real answer. "You don't stop caring," I said. "Not completely. Part of you always wants their approval, but you learn to build a life where that approval isn't necessary, where your sense of worth comes from what you know about yourself, not what they're willing to acknowledge." She nodded slowly, processing. "It takes time," I added, "and it's harder than it sounds, but you can do it. I promise you can." She thanked me and moved away, rejoining the crowd. I watched her go, remembering what it felt like to be where she was, uncertain, hopeful, still believing that if she just tried hard enough, the people who should love her would finally see her clearly. That belief would break eventually. For her, for every woman carrying that particular hope. But what rose from the breaking could be extraordinary. I know that now. Not because my family had finally acknowledged my worth, but because I had acknowledged it myself and built a life that reflected it. The seat at my father's table had never really mattered. What mattered was the one I had chosen for myself, and that one at last was exactly where I belonged. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the one pushed to the margins by people who should have valued you most, I hope you'll carry something with me from this telling. Not anger, though anger has its place. Not bitterness, though that's understandable too. Carry the knowledge that your worth is not determined by people incapable of seeing it. That the seat you choose for yourself will always matter more than the one someone else denies you. That endings, when they finally come, can be the beginning of everything you were meant to become. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. If you have your own story of finding your seat at a table of your own making, I would love to hear it. Share your thoughts, share your experiences, and if this story helped, share it with someone who might need to hear that they are not alone. Because none of us are. Not really. Not when we finally find the courage to stand up.